Hello everyone, these are the Unit 9 notes for Evidence for Evolution. We're going to go over the major categories of evidence that we use to support the evolution of different species. So let's get introduced with a reminder about what evolution is. And it is the change in the frequency, that's how common some traits are, the frequency of alleles in a population. So if some traits get more common than others, evolution has occurred. So it's not just one organism, it's the whole population. So strep throat bacteria, for example, has evolved resistance to antibiotics. And we can see this happen in many different situations, and we have to prepare for it with regulation of antibiotics. And we have something larger like birds evolving from dinosaurs, a much larger change in the traits of these populations over time. So a good model for evolution is just to start with inheritance. So traits are passed down through generations. So if you share traits, you are more related to the person that you got those traits from, and you share DNA. So if you share DNA, you probably share traits and a common ancestry between you. So the major categories of evidence, the first one would be anatomy. This is historically what people have often done to compare organisms. So basic review of cladograms, that's how we grouped organisms by certain traits. So we could have a backbone, jaws, walking legs, a shell to egg, and hair. So all of these guys, except for the lancelet, are going to have that vertebrate column, that backbone. The lancelet is going to have a back nerve, so he's very similar, but not quite the same. The lamprey doesn't have jaws, but everybody else does. And you can group these organisms, so we can say that the leopards are probably more closely related to the turtles because they share more traits. But not all traits are going to be evidence. There's different types of structures. So we have different forelimbs here of all these different organisms. These are called homologous structures. They have very similar structures in the way the bones are arranged, but they have very different functions. They do different stuff. Humans' hands are not walking, they're grasping stuff. Bats are forelimbs are for flying. A porpoise, similar to a dolphin, more like a fin for swimming. Even though they do different things, they're going to have very similar bone structures, and this similarity is suggesting common ancestry. Now, these are all wings, and even though they're all wings, they're all very different in the way that they're made. Even though they have similar functions, very different structures. So this does not suggest common ancestry here. So we have a whale fin and a fish fin. Which do you think is going to be the homologous structure or analogous structure? Excuse me, do you think these two are homologous or analogous to each other? Well, they have very similar function. They're both for swimming. They have very different structures, very different arrangement of bones. So these are analogous structures, so we wouldn't say that having fins makes them related. This is another POCA model, so we can count the number of bones in these forelimbs and see the similarities between them. Even though they all do very different things, and they can look different, they have that one, two, many, and then many. So forelimb, upper forelimb, two lower forelimbs, and then a large arrangement of finger and hand bones. The fossil record can be very similar, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the geologic timescale. So the layers of the rocks and the fossils found within them are going to help really give us some information here. So fossils can show us extinct and extant species. Extant are the living ones. Even living creatures, that we can still find fossils of some of those. Just their older relatives. So most fossils, 2.5 billion years ago to today. Before 2.5 billion years ago, there wasn't a lot of fossils. It wasn't until about the Cambrian explosion when we started getting lots of these sea creatures that we actually started finding lots of fossils. And because of the law of superposition, if If an organism is buried in sediments, more sediments pile on top of that, so we can assume that older fossils are below younger fossils. So that gives us a time frame for these organisms. We can also use carbon dating. We can use a carbon-14 radioactive isotope that we know how it changes over time. So we can measure the specific amount of this carbon-14 that is there, and we can use it to indicate a very accurate time. So combining the fossil record with the anatomy, the bones that we see left over or whatever structures we have in that fossil, can give us a timeline of evolution. So fossils of different horse and horse-like species can give us a really good frame for how the horse has evolved over the past few million years. And based on their location and the age of the rocks, we can get a good time and picture of how this horse has evolved and where it's changed, and which organisms made it and which organisms did not. Archaeopteryx is probably my favorite fossil of all the fossils that we have. So we have basic theropod dinosaur fossils walking on two legs. They've got the longer necks and the sharp teeth. And then we've got more recent bird fossils. They also walk on two legs. They're different in some ways, but they're also very similar. Once we found Archaeopteryx, this is a dinosaur. It's more similar to the theropods here, but it also has lots of feathers. So this feathered dinosaur here gave us the link to connect dinosaurs to modern-day birds. So we know that modern-day birds have evolved from some forms of dinosaurs. And we can do the same thing with humans. There's so many different hominid fossils that we've found and put together, and the age of those fossils can give us a great timeline of how humans and where humans have evolved through the past couple hundred thousands of years. And the last major kind of evidence is biochemical. So looking at things like DNA. So if you share 97% similarity with one organism and 50% similarity with a different organism, then you're probably more related to the one that you share 97% with. If you're more related to your brother, then you probably share more DNA with him than you do with your friend. So biochemical could be DNA. It could also be that the thing that the DNA codes for, the amino acids and the proteins, like hemoglobin and enzymes, they can show relationships too. And it's probably one of the most helpful evidences that we have for showing relationships. And we do that a lot with different organisms, and we can do that with humans and chimpanzees, who share so much similar DNA, but more so than to gorillas or to orangutans. Another good type of evidence would be embryology. So how an embryo develops over time. All these look very similar, but as they develop and change over time, they start to look a lot different. So even though they all look very similar at the beginning, this one over here was a human, this one over here was a fish. So the development over time can give us a window into how these organisms have evolved too. And structures can be lost. So evolution doesn't always move forward. It's not always moving towards the more complex. That's a general trend, but it doesn't always work like that. It's more reactive. It's not proactive in let's try to get these organisms to fly or let's move towards swimming. So a vestigial structure is a leftover structure. A regressive trait is when it has lost the function. So you could lose the structure or you could lose the function. We've got the appendix. So our appendix organs have lost a lot of their original functions, and we can actually have them removed and we'll still be okay. That Darwin point, if you remember from the genetics survey, is thought to be a leftover vestigial structure of more primitive ears. Snakes still have these kinds of leg bones, these spurs on their in their skeletons. And some fish that live in caves, like this blind tetra, have lost their eyes. They didn't. They weren't from this long lineage of fish without eyes and then found their way into caves. They were probably fish that lived outside of the cave and then went into the cave, and over time they have since lost their eyes. We can kind of combine all this to look at the evolution of cetaceans or whale-related species. So are whales more like fish or mammals? So they have hair. They develop internally inside of an organism, and they have mammary glands, all pointing to mammals. Did they evolve from land mammals, though? The mammals on land, or have they always been in the water? Well, they have vestigial, those leftover hip and leg bones. They breathe air. They have fossils, whale-like fossils that have a blowhole, not in the front, not up on the top like they do today, but halfway in between. This is a transitional fossil that shows us the transitional stages of whales and land mammals. And dolphins in their embryos, actually, you can see the nose start on the front of the face and then in the embryo develop and move towards the back as it grows. And there's a great video on that. I highly suggest you guys watch a little bit more of that if you want more detail. And all the fossils and time periods of birds really give us a great window into their evolution too. It's really cool. And you guys are going to have some practice questions. I hope this was very helpful. Thank you.